Welcome to The Whole Pineapple. I'm Ruby Boris.
And I'm Ann Judge. The Whole Pineapple is a podcast about wellness focused around fertility. And on these weekly mini episodes, we bring you bite-sized ideas for you to snack on.
Like breathing exercises, book reviews. Maybe we'll review some scientific research, or we'll share some wellness and fertility stories from our listeners.
So if you're looking for a tip or a trick related to your fertility and well-being, then you've come to the right place.
Let's dig in.
Well, welcome back for our short snack. We are very pleased to welcome back Dr. Ella Stevenson, who is a PhD nursing researcher, and hopefully you had a chance to listen to her full episode where we really got into some interesting ideas about what his research told us about the experience of fertility, especially that on the partner side. And today we want to go more into what people don't always think about, but what it's like being a provider, because there's a lot of research about this idea of compassion fatigue and the stress of going through infertility. Supporting people through that stress is also a really draining process. And I know we have actually a pretty significant chunk of listeners that are people that work in the fertility field. And so I'm really excited to hear more about what you're learning in this area. So welcome back to The Whole Pineapple.
Thanks for having me.
So where should we start? How did you end up wanting to study this as a question?
I was attending a national conference with fertility nurses, and I was invited out to dinner with a bunch of senior nurse leaders. They were asked to talk about what is the number one challenge in management and fertility nursing. And the idea of burnout, well, they didn't use the word compassion fatigue, but it was burnout, that people were burned out in their jobs. And they were concerned about that. And this was before COVID. This was, a few years ago. Little did we know how important and how common it would be to be talking about this. And so it was interesting to me, and I kind of tucked it away, like a lot of my questions. I had some BSN students, some undergrad students who wanted to do some research with me, and they wanted to learn how to do research and participate in the research process. And I said, okay, as long as it's a question I'm interested in. And so I pulled this out of the drawer, so to speak, and we collaboratively wrote a research proposal and submitted to IRB and did all those other good things that you do when you're doing research. And we decided to do a survey-style research study to look at what the construct is compassion fatigue, which is a multidimensional concept where it's looking at compassion fatigue, burnout, and compassion satisfaction. And so we were interested to learn, did fertility nurses have compassion fatigue?
And how do you define compassion fatigue? I mean, what does that mean if someone's just listening?
So compassion fatigue is basically the cost of caring, is what sometimes people like to say. In areas where people have to support others in physically and emotionally stressful situations, whether it's as nurses, for example, helping patients.
But also like teachers, right? Teachers. Like anybody in any of these caring professions.
Or anybody that's caring for like somebody with cancer or dementia is another common one that it comes up with.
Yeah, anybody who cares for another person or group of people is at risk for compassion fatigue and burnout.
And so how was your study done? How many people were you looking at?
We designed this questionnaire study, and we used a validated tool, which is a tool that's been used in a lot of different settings. And it's been used in oncology nursing and emergency room nursing and ICU nursing. It had never been used with fertility nurses. There's actually nothing in the literature about fertility nurses. Another reason why I was particularly interested. We asked some demographic information as well, and I was also interested in whether nurses were A, experiencing it, and B, if it potentially led to them wanting to leave the profession. I also allowed them the opportunity to provide a narrative statement. Wasn't required, but just, anything else you want to share with me. And again, that's just that little bit of qualitative research, qualitative information that just helps provide a little bit more dimension into the results we end up finding. And so we sent it out to as many clinics across the country as we could send it out to. And we had nurses, I cannot remember off the top of my head our sample size. I want to say it was around 200 to 250 nurses who completed the survey. It was a pretty good size.
And how common is it? Are we compassion fatigued? I mean, I sure feel like we are. We see it's always been a challenge for clinic structures, the fact that fertility nursing is such a specialty field that it takes usually someone a year or two before they're really fully independent, understand the ins and outs, can answer a bunch of questions. And then often a year or two after that, they are burnt out. It's very hard, I think, emotionally to be a part of so much trauma for other people. And especially the newer nurses, I think you feel everything so deeply. And then sometimes as you've been in the field for a while, then you feel bad that you're more jaded because you kind of have to develop a little bit more boundary between yourself and patients.
Well, and nursing as a whole is at higher risk for compassion fatigue in general. I mean, I remember it being a hot button topic when I was graduating from my undergraduate program too, talking about nursing burnout and how many people leave the profession to do something completely different. So on top of that, you have an emotionally stressful nursing role. And I think I'm curious to see what the results were.
So we defined that there was different levels of compassion fatigue, but what was interesting was when we saw whether it was associated with some of the other questions. So what we found was that longevity definitely was associated with compassion fatigue. There was an element of wanting to leave the bedside. If you had more compassion fatigue, it definitely put people at risk of thinking about different profession or different setting. But what was interesting, again, for me, and I think this just maybe speaks to the fact that maybe I'm just truly a qualitative researcher at heart, was I looked at all of those statements that people provided, and I think about 50 people or so responded with some sort of a statement that they didn't have to. And that in and of itself, to me, said something that people had something else to say. Mm-hmm. I did a little thematic analysis, and there were more negative statements than there were positive. And maybe that's kind of predictable, right? You have the opportunity to say something, it's like leaving a bad restaurant review on Yelp, right?
Exactly.
Maybe that's it. But basically that nurses, cited the workload was really heavy and that there was just a lot of healthcare needs for their patients. And I think basically that there wasn't as much space for nurses to attend to some of those other things for their patients that they wish they could because of just competing interests. It was a busy, stressful experience. But I think also what came out was how many people just loved working with their patients. And that came out loud and clear. There might have been I am very stressed, but I love what I do. And so many people felt really privileged and lucky to be able to work with this population and really wanted, the best for their patients. But of course, we're feeling the stress and strain associated with it. It was good to define it. What do we do about it is the next question. I don't have that answer just yet. It's something I think about. But yeah, the fertility nurses are feeling the stress and strain for sure, but they want to be there. They want to provide excellent care to their patients.
When I feel like, as you said in the beginning, it's very interesting looking at this research and then thinking about what's been happening with COVID, because at least from what I've read with the studies that they're doing, what's really stressful for so many people working in healthcare during the pandemic is that sense that you're not able to do the job you want to do. Like you're not able to be doing it to the best of your ability because of all these external, you have too many patients, this and that. And that's, I think, what is the challenge with fertility nurses is it's gotten so much more complex now than it used to be even when I started. And so I think, at least from what I see from people here, that's where a lot of that strain comes from. It's that I want to be doing things in a different way that I'm not able to. And that's what's so hard personally. I think you can handle the ups and downs of the emotions, but that sense that you wish you were operating in a different way and you don't have any control over the insurance company that requires all these pre-authorizations to cover, or, things are tricky now. And I wish that there was an easy fix, but I don't know what it is. And it's not existing as easy.
And Anne, for our listeners, since you are a resident nurse coordinator, I worked the weekends, but the weekends are a different animal. So as a coordinator, I know things have changed since you were a coordinator, but what is a typical day like for a nurse?
I don't know if I could if I had started in the field now, I don't know if I would last because there's so much you're doing. You're doing a lot of logistical work. Usually when you're coming in, you already have a full to-do list of cycles you're trying to coordinate. You're trying to get calendars, dates approved with the lab, often filling out requisitions for genetic testing for embryos. That's, I think, been just such a huge change. When I started here, doing PGT or PGTA, different terminology, testing the chromosomes of embryos before transferring for implantation was pretty rare. We really just did it if someone was a carrier of a serious genetic condition because we didn't have as good techniques for vitrification. Embryos didn't survive the biopsy and the thaw as well. And so you would only be compromising the health of that embryo if you had a lot to gain by wanting to do genetic testing. But with the development of vitrification, which is that flash freeze, and it's just allowed us to biopsy embryos without really making that much of a difference in their chances of implanting. And so now it's almost flipped where, at least in our center, and I think a lot of others, it's more rare to have an old school IVF cycle where you just put in an embryo that looked good onto the embryologist. Everybody wants sort of this max amount of information, but there are a lot of downsides to that as well, which would be a fascinating topic to get into. But from the nursing point of view, it means almost every cycle is so much more complex than it used to be, because you're having to coordinate not just getting the patient through the physical process of the eggs coming out, but all the paperwork that was required for whatever is going to be testing for those embryos. And it's now split into completely 2 cycles. You're not just in one go stimulating the ovaries, retrieving eggs, putting them with sperm, putting an embryo in the uterus. You're freezing in the middle, finding out if you have a normal embryo, which means the nurse coordinator has to coordinate a whole nother transfer cycle down the road, which involves, again, a lot of logistical details and emotional support. You're having to talk to patients about the results. You're having to deal with patient frustrations when there are delays, when they're not able to get in and cycle as quickly as they'd like to. Often you're still doing some form of patient care as well, whether you're in some clinics performing inseminations or meeting with someone if they have a question about their medication or if they're having a reaction, is this normal? So you're fielding questions that come in throughout the day about all these questions, while also in some magical non-existent moment working on your to-do list of all the things that have built up that you have to get done. And it's because it's so complex, it's hard when nurses are not having the time they need, because you can't just hire somebody and have them hop in and help. It takes a long time to get people trained, and doing that training takes a lot of work. And so it's a really tough situation for clinics where they want to have often more people on staff, but you got to have someone to train them. And it's going to take time before they're able to be fully independent. So it's a tough job, and I cannot say enough good things about the nurses that are doing it. You know, I love this field, especially coming from a labor and delivery nurse where you see people for this very brief, intense moment. I love the fact that fertility care gives you this long-term relationship. You know, I've been here, 14, almost 15 years now. And so I have seen people come back for multiple fertility journeys. And I feel so privileged. And I think that's why nurses stay in this field, is you really do develop a patient bond. But that's also why it's hard, because you really care about people. You've seen them through so many ups and downs. And it's really hard to not take that with you when you go home.
If you're listening and you're wondering if your outcome or what you're going through is impacting your nurse, it absolutely is. Mm-hmm. It is, for sure. So,
gosh, that was all me, my long soliloquy. But I'm glad we're talking about it, because it's something that I think sometimes from a management point of view, people see nurses as just these little cogs they can plop in different places, and they don't realize that it's a lot, and you have to value your nurses and you have to support them to really be a successful clinic.
Absolutely. You know, I mean, nursing is the backbone of healthcare, right? We're the largest number of healthcare providers in this country, and patients trust us and need us, and we're highly trained and can respond to the whole person. But we also have to learn how to take care of ourselves. And I know as an educator of nurses, it's something, you know, you alluded to it too, Ruby, that you talked about that in your program, is that trying to help future nurses know how to be their best self in the work setting, but also making sure that they can go home and be their best selves when they're home as well. It's a really challenging balance, and we don't have the answer to it, unfortunately, but we're really trying. We're really trying to figure out how we can keep nurses happy and healthy so they can show up for their patients, because this is why we went into the field, right? I think the majority of us go in to become a nurse because we want to help people.
This is, you know, we're a bunch of nurses talking here. I just feel like our brains work a little bit different. We're trained a little bit different. I think there's a reason for why we're consistently voted the most trustworthy healthcare providers. So very, very important. And I do think it is helpful for patients that are going through to know what your nurses are experiencing and how much they're doing to help too. And a lot of our nurses have been on your end too.
Mm-hmm. And yes, if the nurse is not answering the phone when you call for a question, it's because she's already answered another question or doing something else. We're never ignoring anybody. I think that's the hard part. People don't realize the vast amount of stuff that a nurse is having to do on a daily basis. And you wish that you could instantly pick up the phone and answer every call as they come in. But that's what's hard too, when you're like, oh my gosh, I really need to call this person back. Oh, but I really need to call that person too. Mm-hmm. That I think is what makes people just feel so burnt out. It's like, I can't do all the things I want to do in the time that I have.
I'm on the phone answering this question, but then a portal message comes up with this question. Oh, but I have to track down the physician or the nurse practitioner to answer this question for me. And good luck doing that, because we are enigmas and tend to be just, especially some of ours, that you can hear them walking away, but you can never catch up with them. So it's a lot of coordinating a lot of people. Like RNs are true nurse coordinators in our clinic. They coordinate not only patient cycles and the logistics, but also their providers too.
Now, is this something that you looked at with an international perspective as well, or has the research been all in the U.S.?
No, this was, I just sent the survey out to all SART member sites, clinics. So it was just in the U.S. I have ideas about where I might want to take it next. But, like anything else, it just takes time.
Yeah. What are some of if you had your way, what would your next project be?
I have too many ideas right now. Right now, I have to finish writing everything up, because that's something I'm really guilty about, coming up with new and exciting ideas and starting new projects, and still, trailing behind in the report out. So I've set myself a new goal, is to publish everything, all the data I currently have sitting in my computer.
How do you keep track of your ideas? Do you have like a notebook? Do you have a Word file? Like, when things come to you?
I do have a file started of just some ideas, but sometimes ideas find me. And so I really, I had students who have just come to me again, and this is the teacher in me. They want to do something together. So I'm like, okay, let's figure something out. And so sometimes that will kind of move a topic up a little bit higher in the list. And I don't always mind it, because it's always really interesting. I had students a few years ago wanted to do a research study. So we did a study looking at graduate students on our campus. Where do they get their fertility knowledge, and what are intentions about egg freezing? And we published it, and that was great for the students. And I thought it was also just really important information. So yeah, sometimes the topics find me, but if I had to do something, if I had my druthers and I had all the time and money in the world, I actually want to probably define the experience of fertility, or understand the experience of fertility and infertility in developing countries.
Oh, hey.
Really interested, because I've done a little bit of global work. I've done some work in the Philippines, but I would love to go into countries that don't have the resources necessarily, but where fertility has a huge stigma culturally, and understand that a little bit better.
Oh,
that is fascinating.
You'll have to come back in like 4 years. We can talk all about it.
Yeah. Go work on that, and then we'll come on back.
Yeah.
It just has a different meaning in terms of, like, parenthood has a different meaning in different cultures, right? So the majority of people in this country not having a child doesn't really associate so much with a stigma, or societally, there isn't this expectation as much to have children. But in some cultures, that is the expectation, is to have children. When a couple's not able to conceive and have a pregnancy, the blame often falls at the feet of the women. And, sorry about the dog.
They really have some things to say.
They're into the cross-cultural research. So.
They really are. They're like, you need to start this project now.
Right. I think that's just floated to the top of the pile. Yeah. So it's just fascinating to me when I think about dynamics in couples and in cultures, and, the importance of what parenthood means to people, to communities, and then how it intersects with fertility and the ability to get pregnant.
Well, I saw there's an article, random article about, I guess, a lawsuit filed in India where parents are suing their children for not giving them grandchildren, because we paid for this big expensive wedding. We've given you a couple years. Where are my grandchildren? So you're right. There's so much.
I saw the headline on that.
I saw the headline. I don't know the details. I know legally people said they don't think this will go anywhere. But even the fact that this is something that's out there, it kind of tells you the expectations that can be there.
Oh boy.
It's really important. I know that there's some work in Africa, in certain African countries, to help women who aren't able to have families kind of find stability going forward, because in some cultures, when a child isn't produced, she's actually ostracized from the family and then leaves her with no ability to support herself. And so there are projects to help women find careers and jobs to be able to sustain themselves. But it's just still fascinating to me that it's just a very different experience than we have for the most part in this country.
Yeah, that's just a whole nother lens to look at this fertility journey. It's across the globe.
And such a good example of all the different places research
Yeah.
can take you, you know? So if nurses are listening and you're feeling your compassion fatigue and you're like, maybe I need a break from this, maybe you go into research.
I'm here.
If you have a neurodivergent brain like I do and you're always wanting new projects, research probably would be a good.
It would be okay.
Feeling stressed, get a PhD. It's so relaxing.
So relaxing.
Yes.
That's a strategy.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Well, you're so inspired to talk to you. I love that you always have so many different things that you're interested in, but also that you go out there and do it. I mean, that's what's great. I think a lot of us have these questions bouncing around in our brain. And so I think hearing you break it down, it makes the idea of research much more accessible, because there are grants out there. There are not enough nurses doing research, and it can be small within your clinic. Like, there actually is a lot of support. So if you're a nurse listening, talk to your nurse manager, because there actually is a push in the field to get more nurses involved with this. And sometimes just having another, not to add one more project to your plate, but when you're sometimes feeling a little burnt out by the day-to-day, sometimes being able to take a step back and look at something you care about from a bigger picture view can make you feel a little bit more excited about the field again too.
And reach out to somebody that you can partner with, because I often find that, research can be intimidating if you don't think you know what you're doing, even though you probably know a whole lot more than you actually do.
Dust off that statistics textbook that you did in nursing school.
They have programs now. That's the easy part. You just plug in the numbers. Yeah.
Or you hire statisticians, right? And, but no, seriously, like, if anybody does ever want to talk about research or quality improvement, I also teach DNP students and help them with their quality improvement projects. I love quality improvement, and I think that that's something nurses in fertility centers would be perfectly poised to do, is doing quality improvement projects, which are really important. Mm-hmm. And so it's not, it's translating evidence into practice. And in some ways it's more important. Well, I want to say more important than research. They're kind of a yin and a yang, right? One informs the other. But if we don't have people implementing research, then what's the point of research, right? So, go for that quality improvement project as well. So, and reach out. And I'll put a plug in. If anybody wants to talk about a PhD, I'm always accessible. I'm reachable. I love talking about nurses who are interested in going on to grad education, but I think that's just the academic in me.
Yes.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Happy to be here.
This was such a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much, Eleanor, for being with us. And anybody out there, check the show notes. We'll give you some resources. And thank your researchers who are almost behind pretty much everything that you can think of.
Thanks for joining us for this week's episode of the Whole Pineapple Podcast. We hope it was helpful.
If you know someone who could benefit from hearing the podcast, we hope you'll share it with them.
And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review The Whole Pineapple on your favorite podcast app. Every rating and review makes us easier to find.
This podcast is sponsored by Seattle Reproductive Medicine and is produced by Audiotocracy Podcast Production. We'll see you next time. Have a delicious week.